At some point, a lot of us have the same realization. You look around your life and notice that you are paying for a lot of things constantly: rent, subscription, software, media, storage, access, fees. But when you try to think about what you actually own, not just what you can use right now, it's a surprisingly short list. Maybe it's a few pieces of furniture, some clothes, a phone that will feel old in a couple of years, and maybe just a few more things. And that's about it. If you go back a generation or two, ownership was the default expectation. You worked, you saved, and eventually you owned things that stayed yours: a home, a car, tools, media, things you could fix, resell, pass on, or simply keep without asking permission. Now, for many people, that path never really opens up because the conditions around ownership have changed. Housing became harder to access, products turned into subscriptions, and slowly the idea of owning things started to dissolve into something closer to renting your entire life. So this video isn't just about complaining and blaming corporations or governments or some shadowy group pulling strings behind the scenes, but we'll talk about how housing turned into an investment vehicle, or how companies discovered that selling access is more profitable than selling objects, and how an economy built around assets rewards those who already own, while everyone else pays month after month for the right to participate. For most of modern history, ownership didn't start with stocks or businesses. It started with a place to live. Owning a home wasn't just about shelter, but about stability, predictability, and a way to lock in your biggest expense and slowly build something over time. Even if you didn't think of yourself as wealthy, owning a home meant you were participating in a system that rewarded patience. And that's why housing matters so much to this conversation, because when housing becomes unreachable, ownership itself starts to feel unreachable. Most people today don't choose to rent forever. They rent because buying never quite becomes possible. Prices rise faster than wages, and what was once a temporary phase quietly turns into a permanent condition. At some point, housing stopped being treated primarily as a place for people to live and started being treated as a place for money to sit. This was perfectly rational. Housing is kind of stable, it tends to go up in value over time, and in a world of low interest rates and global capital, it became one of the safest places to park wealth. The problem is that when housing functions like an investment, scarcity becomes something good, not bad. If prices rise, owners benefit. If supply stays limited, values are protected. And because homeowners are also voters, local politics often rewards preservation over expansion. Building less feels safer than building more. From the outside, this can look like greed, but most of the time it's just people protecting what they already have. When you rent, your monthly payment doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere, but it doesn't go into your future. Rent builds someone else's equity, someone else's security. This is one of the quiet psychological shifts of modern adulthood. You can do everything right: work, save, avoid major mistakes, and still feel like you are standing still, because the system you are participating in no longer rewards effort with ownership. Over time, this shapes life decisions: where you live, whether you move, whether you start a family, whether you take risks. Ownership gives you room to breathe. Renting keeps you flexible, but also exposed. As housing prices outpace incomes, something else quietly fills the gap: family wealth, gifts, help with down payments, inheritance, parents who already own. This is where the idea of merit-based path to ownership starts to break down. Two people with the same job, the same salary, the same discipline can end up in radically different positions, based not on effort, but on timing and inheritance. And once ownership becomes intergenerational, it reinforces itself. Owners pass down assets, renters pass down rent. This doesn't mean ownership is impossible, but it does mean it's increasingly conditional, and that conditionality reshapes how people experience the economy. None of this means renting is always bad. Renting can make sense. It offers flexibility, it reduces risk. In some cities, it's the better choice. And ownership itself comes with debt and maintenance. The point isn't that everyone should own a home. The point is that ownership used to be broadly accessible, and now it's increasingly selective. And this changed how people relate to everything else they buy, rent, or subscribe to. Housing is where the shift begins. Once ownership becomes difficult in one area of life, it starts to feel normal when it disappears elsewhere. At first, this shows up in small, almost forgettable ways. You stop buying software and you pay monthly for it. You stop owning music, books, or games. You stream them, access them, or license them. None of this feels wrong. In fact, it often feels convenient. Why own something you barely use when you can just pay for access? This kind of shift doesn't feel like a loss, but more like a feature. Also, it's tempting to frame this as a trick, as if companies somehow fooled everyone into renting instead of owning. But that's not really what happened. Subscription models solve real problems. They lower upfront costs, they make updates easier, and they smooth out expenses. And for companies, they provide predictable revenue. From a business perspective, selling access is simply better than selling objects. When you sell a product, you get paid once. When you sell a subscription, you get paid indefinitely. And when those benefits exist, companies naturally organize around them. Here is the part most people don't realize until something disappears. When you buy something digitally, you usually don't own it in the traditional sense. You are purchasing a license, permission to use something under specific conditions. Those conditions can change, access can be revoked, libraries can vanish. And when that happens, there is often nothing you can do about it. Ownership used to mean control, but now it often means temporary permission. Traditional ownership comes with rights that go beyond use. You can fix things, you can resell them, you can keep them working longer than the manufacturer intended. But many modern products are designed in ways that discourage or outright prevent this. Sealed devices, property parts, software locks, subscription dependent features. When repair becomes difficult, replacement becomes normal. And when replacement becomes normal, ongoing payment becomes expected. Durable, repairable products last longer, and that's not great for recurring revenue. Not all subscriptions are bad. Some make a lot of sense. News, media, services that require continuous production. Many creators rely on subscriptions to survive. The problem isn't subscriptions exist. The problem is subscriptions replacing ownership where ownership used to exist, without offering equivalent rights in return. Over time, this reshapes behavior. Why repair something when it's cheaper to replace? Why keep something when access is temporary anyway? Why think long term about things that you are never meant to keep? This logic starts small, but it spreads. And once you get used to paying monthly for everything, entertainment, tools, storage, even features inside products, the idea of owning anything starts to feel strange, almost outdated. At this point, it might feel like we are talking about a series of unrelated changes. Housing got expensive, subscriptions became common, and ownership started to feel conditional. But there is a unifying logic underneath all of this. It's not about technology or preferences, it's about who owns assets and who pays to access them. For a long time, the basic deal of modern life was simple. You worked, you earned income, and over time, that income turned into ownership a home, savings, maybe a small portfolio. But over the last few decades, that pathway has narrowed. Wages grew slowly, assets grew quickly, and once assets start outpacing income, the rules changed. Because if wealth comes primarily from owning things, not from working, then ownership itself becomes the real dividing line. This doesn't mean work doesn't matter anymore. It means effort stopped being as important as it was before. When people hear the word rent, they usually think of housing. But in economic terms, rent is broader than that. It's income earned from controlling something scarce: land, infrastructure, platforms, intellectual property, and more. Once you start looking for it, rent shows up everywhere. Housing rent, subscription fees, platform commissions, or licensing agreements. If you own the platform, the land, the network, or the asset, you don't need to work harder. You just need people to keep showing up. When ownership is delayed or denied, people adjust. They move less, they commit later, they postpone milestones, they stay flexible. Not because they want to, but because flexibility is safer than permanence. Living with parents longer, delaying children, or avoiding long-term obligations. All these aren't cultural specifics. They are rational responses to uncertainty. And in the situation this generation is in, you don't plan decades ahead. You manage month by month. Okay, the problem itself isn't that renting and owning coexist. It's not even that ownership declined. but it's that ownership became asymmetric. Some people rent nearly everything, and others own a huge amount of assets. And once that gap opens, it compounds. So the phrase, "you don't own anything anymore," may not be true now, but just give it a few more years.